I'm gonna, just charge into it. Uh, what I thought I'll do, since we have a half an hour and I didn't necessarily want to make it a very theoretical presentation. I thought I'll bring some sort of high level views, speak about some projects where, we've worked on, or, in the past or currently working on. And then essentially, close off with some summarizing thoughts. And then you guys, and then, you can, then we can sort of open it up for Q&A, as we go along then. That's just generally the outline of the presentation. So, in a way, it doesn't have that much structure. But sort of for a broad level framing, I mean, I think, once you start talking about public transport and we look at sort of how, I mean, this is national level numbers, so not necessarily just urban. But if you look at the growth of motorized transport in India, you can clearly see, I mean, everybody can tell which is the more preferred option in India of transport, right? So two-wheelers, they're competitive, they're cost effective, and so people sort of pick that. Now, and I mean, if you look at that, and then this is the next number that we always say that India has low per capita vehicle ownership and things like that. But if you add two-wheelers on cars, we might have a low per capita vehicle ownership. If I add two-wheelers, and this is all of India, right? So if we use actually probably urban numbers, and given how urban a country like Spain or France or Germany might be, I mean we are in many ways at the European levels of sort of motorization, two-wheeler motorization, but certainly motorization. So I think as we think about planning and things like that, we have to think about it with that perspective. So for me, I think one, as we think about public transport, to a large extent, motorcycles is one of the biggest sort of competing forces, and the fact that we have a pretty high level of motorization, even though it is a two-wheeler led motorization. That's one. Then I want to just, so now we want to talk about promoting public transport, and in the end, I mean the main question in a way is how do we make public transport competitive for the user, right? So for you, for anybody else, how do we make public transport? And we always make this choice on three parameters: cost, time, and comfort. And different people will weigh each of these parameters differently. Most of us will choose comfort, uh, time, and probably cost, and but time and comfort are very very important to us as well, in in addition to cost. So you may not take the lowest cost option. I'm not saying you're not completely cost conscious, but you may not take the lowest cost option. You will probably be have much more sort of spending. So at a time as an individual, we are always making up cost, time, and comfort. But basically, you have to think about transportation as a system. The system where there are roads, right, which is publicly owned, where there is public transport like that runs on these roads, or it runs on tracks, or an elevated metro or whatever in the city. And then there are so this public infrastructure on which private vehicles run, right? That together sort of forms the system. Now, every time a user, that is me, I make a choice, certain choices that I make the system, the whole system worse for everybody else. So at peak hour, say at 9:30 a.m. or say at 6:30 p.m., if with my car I am on the highway, the Western Express Highway, I live in Mumbai, just by being there, I am adding to congestion. So my choice, actually, so my choice, which is a user optimal for me based on sort of cost, time, and comfort, is making the system worse for everybody else. So as a single person, I'm driving a car in the peak hour, with my air conditioned on, with music playing and all of that. So weighing all of the options, that is the best choice for me. But the fact that I am, using that sort of very limited resource at that time means that it makes the system worse for everyone. And I think this is an important concept to understand, because what we are trying to do with public transport, and that is the question, are we achieving it as a secondary thing? What we are trying to do with public transport is we are trying to, make it comfortable, right? So make it in a way, is sort of provided in a way that, based in spite of sort of the cost and comfort choices you make, you are still making that choice. But every time you use public transport, you are not having a negative impact on the system or making it worse for everybody else using the system. So the whole idea of policy making for public transport is really, how do we give an individual, right? An individual, when be somebody with an income that is above 1 lakh rupees a month, or an individual with an income of 10,000 rupees a month. But how do we provide a system that these users can use to use for their choices, and at the same time their choices don't make the system worse for everybody else? And this and then this is really the policy play, right? How do you use then the policy and infrastructure investment to bring about this alignment between user optimal and system optimal? And this is the very basic principle of microeconomics, and how systems get designed. And so, I mean, the question goes back to, how should government, right, drives its policies and its infrastructure alignment so that it is improving public transport, or transport where, without sort of, people making choices then that make the system worse. So just wanted to sort of make this point. This is like the macro level perspective of sort of policy making as you start thinking about public transport. And we don't know to a lot. I mean, sometimes we don't know. I mean, whether these large investments that we'll make in the Delhi metro, whether that is making sure that that you know the majority of the users are improving, and that the system is not. So I think this kind of analysis, a little more, we typically do a cost benefit analysis, we'll do some travel time savings, but whether that is enough, I think, is something that we need to think about. And then, of course, there is also the competition between national, state, and local. Typically roads, etc., that we build are spent by state and local governments. Today, I mean, more this high cost public infrastructure, public transport infrastructure gets national investment. So these are sort of the different investments, and the whole idea is, how do you bring about an alignment in policies and infrastructure that we are able to provide public transport that checks the cost time comfort sort of choices of majority of the people, and if that happens, then more people will use it, and then uh, then the system as a whole will function much better, rather than sort of individuals using their cars and making their localized choices. um, Having said that, so this is sort of the high level perspective I wanted to give, and based on this, no, I will actually get into a few specific cases where we are doing some work, two about sort of bus-based transport and two about rail-based transport, and we'll sort of try to bring back this theme of sort of where should the where should the policy or infrastructure investments go, right? So again, just doing a check. Everybody can hear me. I am audible. All of that, right? So it's hard for me to tell in this. So I'm just, trying to make sure that that happens. Okay. So I mean, let's start with city buses now. I mean, if you look at city buses, city bus transport, which is one of the largest forms of public transport in our country, is struggling. Is struggling. If you look at some of the big cities, whether it's Bangalore, Mumbai, Delhi, ridership numbers have been falling year on year. And one of the big reasons is that speeds are ridiculously low, right? Bangalore, BMTC bus travels at less than 10 kilometers an hour. In Mumbai, a BST bus is 7-8 kilometers an hour. And I mean, I think for people for whom time is an important factor, just don't take this. They take this mode, because you can take anywhere between 2.5 hours and 2.5 and 3 hours to make a journey, right? So this is sort of the one of the bigger challenges. The other is, in smaller cities, typically in the past, these systems. I mean, if you let alone this top 10 cities, I think beyond that, we didn't really have public transport in the cities, and so most of these cities now have the public-private partnerships, where which were all triggered by these investments, that people received, or the buses that various cities received as part of the JNURM program, and these cities, these systems haven't been able to scale beyond certain levels, so 100, about in the most like 200-300 buses, that again, one is the competition with motorcycles that I talked about, but also, I mean, I think a lot of these places, shared auto rickshaws now, even in cities like Bangalore, Mumbai, other places, Uber Pool, Ola Share started to compete. And of course, and a lot of this in India also, just to say, I mean, for in India, basically all bus operations are governed, by what was called the 1958 Act of State Road Transport Undertakings, the STU Act. And the 1958 Act basically gave when I say the state, I mean the state government, the monopoly to run public transport on its roads. So, and then the state gives out the permission or the permits to various sort of actors to run public transport. But the state actually has the monopoly right. So any road in the state, government can say, oh, you cannot run public transport, right? So this 1958 undertaking actually empowered, and we created these big state road transport undertakings. It's part of the whole nationalization plan that happened in the late 50s, early 60s. But now we have these sort of state transport undertakings, and because of their design, etc., they have quite a few inefficiencies to cope with. And over the last 20 years, whether it's, generally because the deterioration that was seen in state-run public transport, or sort of these very successful bus rapid transit models or the public-private partnerships that happened between sort of late 90s and early 2000s in Latin America, that there was a lot of talk about running bus transport without subsidies. But and that is difficult, because what I mean, again, something that we've seen with our work, that you do need 20 to 30% viability gap funding, because revenue and cost don't always sort of align very well. So in this picture, I'm going to talk about a couple of case studies. And I'm not going too deep, but just trying to make sure, because we have about 20 minutes, and I want to try to finish this. So Bangalore, BMTC, is one of the best sort of run bus companies in India. They've done very well on financial management. So they, in many years they've actually shown positive, shown profits, shown more revenue than costs. Fleet sizes increased consistently. They actually have slowly expanded services and provided for the entire metropolitan region. Over the years, one of the things they've done really well is developed a land management strategy. So they've had they have these depots and terminals, and then they have done sort of, I mean, you need good, well-located depots and terminals to be able to run a good, service, right? A good hub and spoke, or whatever, a good sort of route design. They were one of the early ones to introduce this differentiated service, introduce AC bus services, introduce airport services. So they've done all of that, and now they did a very progressive technology transition as well. All of their 6,000 odd buses have GPS units. They moved to automatic fare collection, all of that, right? So they have a system that is sort of tracked fully with technology. So they've done all of that, but if we just, and this goes back to the point that I've been saying, and why I brought up the point of sort of this idea of user optimal and system optimal, is BMTC. If you look at what has happened in the last 10 years, it's increased its service, its number of buses. It's increased the number of routes it operates on, but passengers have lowered, right? There are lesser people using that. Why is this? And one of the big reasons is basically, fleet utilization. When we say, whether how many trips a bus makes or how many kilometers a bus run, and the vehicle utilization has dropped significantly. And this is because simply the one big reason why this is happening is buses are stuck in congestion. And you know, and what it does, right? Buses are stuck in congestion. It reduces the fuel efficiency. It reduces the earning, and all of that. So you get into a very vicious cycle because of, so your passengers decrease, so your fuel efficiency reduces, so your costs go up, your revenues come down, and then you are not able to invest back, and so your fleet starts to get older, and you get into this very poor sort of. And I think so that's the reason. Some of the challenges that what can really, I mean, I think if BMTC has to improve has to improve its services, it clearly needs to improve the speed of its buses in the peak hours. So how does one do that, right? And I mean, broadly, I think it is making sure that there's what we call matching demand and supply. So making sure the supply means the buses are there where the demand is at the right moments, right? And one of the easiest ways to prioritize buses is dedicated infrastructure. And I will talk about a good example of dedicated infrastructure next. But what does dedicated infrastructure? One is to create the bus rapid transit, put dedicated bus lanes. BMTC also attempted one. Bus only one ways in the peak hours. I grew up in Mumbai. I remember growing up in all the peak hours, all of the station feeders going to the train stations would run on bus only one way. So in the peak direction, they would only allow buses to go, and that really allowed station feeding to happen much more faster. So there are ways. I mean, bus only one ways, bus malls, bus only flyovers have been used in many cases. And of course, strategically located terminals so buses can turn around. You can terminate services, turn them around wherever possible if there is signal priority, so the buses can jump, do some queue jumping. They cannot be stuck in traffic. So, dedicated infrastructure is one way in which you can sort of prioritize services. The other is actually through doing better service plans, right? So, while working for BMTC a few years ago, and for some of you, you might be familiar with Bangalore. If not, there is this Hosur Road corridor which runs from the center of the city, goes to Electronic City and then further goes down to Hosur. And where if you looked at running the buses from Brigade Road, which is in the center of the city, to Electronic City, there were about 25 stops, and that bus would take say 670 to 85 minutes to go there. Now 70% of that demand on that route was only in 8 stops, but the bus was stopping in 25 stops, and 40% of the time in a bus's journey is stop time. It's the time it takes to decelerate, slow down, stop, pick up passengers, and accelerate. So what we had recommended is maybe every third bus or every fifth bus actually skip stops, right? So it stops only on these 8 stops. That would reduce travel time, so every time it has to skip a stop, then it doesn't have to go to the left, slow down, get stuck, all of that thing doesn't happen. And so a skip a stop service has the potential of reducing, almost by 30% travel times. But the whole thing the other thing is buses get stuck in traffic, and a lot of times, in the peak hours, passengers are waiting, but buses are all stuck in one place, or they're all bunched up. And there are techniques in which you can just actually have parked buses, say at 5 o'clock or something, at some specific locations, and then you can introduce them at the right moment as the traffic tends to come. But to do that, we really need to be able to have very good data about where the buses are, where the passengers are, what is the demand, how do we best match the supply to the demand. And this is what we call digitizing, so digitizing the data, whether it's about passengers, whether it's about the buses, and then using that data to optimize, and then, of course, figuring out techniques or tactics or strategies to prioritize. So I think someone like Bangalore, to better promote public transport, will need to think about how it can digitize, optimize, and prioritize buses so that they will be able to go back even to that 2008 levels of demand. So just wanted to sort of, and this is the challenge in some of the big cities, whether it's Mumbai, whether it's, Delhi. It's really about finding ways to overcome the challenges that are caused by country. So this is one case. I actually don't have that much more time now. I'm going to have to rush through this. I'm going to still probably try to take maybe 10 more minutes. So Indore, this is so Indore. I think is an interesting case of a medium-sized city, a successful case of a medium-sized city. So in 2000, Indore basically MPSRTC basically declared bankruptcy, right? And so Madhya Pradesh has no public transport or did not have any public transport around this time of say 2005 to between sort of 2004 2005 because they shut down MPSRTC. So in 2006 in Indore, basically for the first time, they basically they created certain routes. They invited operators to operate these buses on these routes. They created what is called net cost contracts, where the buses would but the operators would keep the earnings from these routes and operate a certain number of buses on that routes, and all of the costs associated with running those buses, etc., will be there. And they bid actually for the route. So they paid a certain premium to Indore City Transport Services Limited, which was an SPV that was created specifically to run these buses. So they started with net cost contracts for 5 operators and 40 buses, 2006. Of course, this has sort of evolved, and I'll sort of talk to you about different things have happened. They have changed the way they have done contracting. They're also doing some additional services, all of that. So I'll talk about that a little bit. Also around that time, they started to do this project, which is the Bus Rapid Transit project. And this is just the statistics. This was opened in 2014, and this is how it looks in a way, right? That buses are prioritized; they don't get stuck in traffic, while the rest of the cars and other vehicles that carry less number of people. So you have to remember that the number of people in this bus are pretty much the same as the number of people you see in all of these vehicles put together, right? So it's far more efficient. Even though this looks empty, it's actually far more efficient use of these assets because more number of people are able to sort of travel at a faster speed. And this is actually a beautiful example of how choices made by someone like this who's in a car is actually slowing down everybody else here, but the choice made by someone here is able to move faster. And this is sort of the bringing back the theory of this concept of this user optimal and system optimal that comes. Anyway, here are some photos. But I think one of the things I want to say is, again, I think it's a system. A bus system is a system. You have to have priority. I mean, segregated based busways is one way of providing priority. But I think we need really safe spaces to get on and get off buses. I mean, getting on and getting off buses is the second highest cause or the third highest cause of road accidents in a city. To be able to do that, you want buses. Of course, you need to be able to centralize control. And this is going back to my point of optimize, digitize, is to be able to sort of really plan and operate the system completely with data, and then actually creating good branding. And so, BRT that was done in Indore was developed as a system. It had all of these elements, and it was able to. What the other point I do want to make is what was very, very powerful is that basically if you do a simple cost benefit analysis, the benefits accrued from running this system for a period of 6 years, which is the life of bus, is about 300 crores. So the project cost was about 140 crores. Of course, there was some additional cost from land acquisition, but by the time, in 6 years, the project had created benefits or created savings that were sort of worth 265 crores. So you literally had a public resource saving of 125 crores, and it's a prime demonstration of how installing a more flexible, lower cost capital cost system really becomes a very cost effective way of sort of providing mass transport in these cities. Basically today, if you were to look again, they are running about 300 buses. So from those 40 buses in 2006, number has gradually increased. They're hoping to get more buses. They've always used all of these buses, whether it's from JNURM or from the FAME programs, etc. So that that sort of is the viability gap that comes into sort of these that can be sort of passed on to the operators then to cover for the gaps between revenue and cost. Pre-pandemic, they had about 175, 180,000 passengers per day. I mean, now the numbers are lower. But you also want to remember that in these cities, so in Indore, when there are about 300 of these buses that are running as part, there is another 800 Tata Magics, these that run, each of which carries about 500-600 passengers. So another 4 lakh passengers are using these small size mini buses, midi buses kind of thing. So uh, Ankita, I wanted to ask you, I mean, it's 4:30. I have a couple more case studies. I don't necessarily want to sort of take all the time. So do you think I can just wrap it up in 5 minutes and then we can take questions? Is that your recommendation?
Yeah, if you're able to hear me. Yes.
Anyway, I guess I'll sort of do that then. I mean, just for this. So what I will do is, I had some slides. I'm going to sort of run through them very quick. I'm not going to show them, and I'll just do some summary slides, and just and then we can open up for questions. But anyway, what I wanted to say is, again, public transport just can't be taught in isolation. Public transport is part of a system, and we need to think about the system as a whole. And typically, in most Indian cities, typically urban transport reforms happen in 3 generations. If you look at the Western city, first you build a road network. A lot of cities we have actually poor road networks. A lot of missing links. And the network is not connected, not uniform. The rings and the radials are not always there. So completing the road networks is usually called first generation reform. A lot of we've also seen then these once your road networks are complete, you do walking, cycling, public transport, provide priority to public transport, provide subsidy to public transport, and really promote it as a mode, promote these things as a mode. This is usually the second generation of reform. And then now we are seeing the third generation of reform, really the emergence of the shared mobility and also electrification. And one of the biggest challenges we have, and it's not just about promoting public transport, but in Indian cities, we have to do all of these 3 generations of urban transport reform simultaneously, where we complete our road networks, we make sure that we make them walking, cycling friendly, provide priority to public transport, and move to the electrification agenda as well. That's one. And so, I mean, I think what do we think? One, I think buses need to be given adequate attention. I was going to talk a little more about it. One of the biggest investments in public infrastructure in India, in public urban infrastructure, is in the metros. They're going to invest about 30 billion. Has already been invested. There is another 50 billion in the pipeline. And I think we need to figure out how we make sure that this investment is most optimally allocated. And this is where also I think ideas of land value capture and other things need to be brought to the table. Like I said, I think we do a lot of disincentives. So parking is free. Parking is, so I think as we look at our streets, we need to make sure they're future safe, future ready, and things like parking, etc., needs to be priced, because today I think it's cheaper to use the car, and I think we need to find ways to make people pay the full cost of using the car by charging for parking, by charging for road use, etc. We need to, and electrification is going to happen. We should just make sure that it does not happen in isolation, but all of the first 3 things that I mentioned are done as well. And this is the moment you're seeing a lot of new devices, data is becoming more and more available, and payments are becoming digital. So this whole technology transition needs to be fully utilized to be able to sort of transition all of these 4 points that I was talking about. And finally, I mean, I really think what is required, right? One, I think we really need to, overall sort of, highlight the importance of public transport, why it is necessary, and why it is only the only way actually to address these challenges of congestion and social costs that we are creating in our cities. But once that is done, we really need to make sure that skilling and capacity building, for data-driven planning and operations happens today. I mean, in a lot of ways, our public companies are not equipped to do this, and with the data available, it is actually very easy, very powerful be able to do it. Financial planning actually is extremely important, and really land value capture is essential for high cost systems like the metro. So I think, and we have to make sure all components are funded. So you can't just do the trains and ignore the walkways and the last mile connectivity and the platforms. You really have to fully think about the system as a whole. Land is a very difficult issue, and a lot of times not enough attention is paid to make sure that land for depots and terminals is allocated properly, because without that we are also not able to do this intermodal integration and those kinds of things. And of course today, fare collection is digital, and this is where also. So I think this whole opportunity 1 and 4 to me is much more the technology transition. 3 is much more about land, and 2 is about actually really financing and figuring out financing of these systems. So these are sort of very critical elements that we need to create. 1 and 4 will help us to digitize, optimize, electrify. 3 and 2 will ensure that we have sort of financially sustainable systems. 2 and 3. Yeah, and I think for all of this to happen, we need to put good governance systems in place. Anyway, with that, I'll stop and open up for questions.